My colleague interrupted me in every meeting, so I started agreeing with everything he said. Have you ever worked with someone who simply can't keep their mouth shut? I have this colleague. Let's call him Mark. And Mark has a serious problem. He cannot let anyone finish a sentence. Seriously, it doesn't matter what's happening. If someone is speaking in a meeting, Mark has to interrupt to give his opinion. Even if it's a completely unnecessary opinion. Even if it's obvious he has no idea what he's talking about. Even if he's just repeating what someone else just said, but worse. And his favorite target? Me. I don't know exactly why. Maybe because I'm one of the few on the team who actually knows what I'm doing. Maybe because I don't raise my voice to argue, and he takes advantage of that. Or maybe because he just likes hearing his own voice more than anything else. At first, I tried to be patient. I thought it was just an annoying habit. Some people don't realize they interrupt others, right? So, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. But over time, it started driving me crazy. I would start speaking and barely get halfway through a sentence before Mark cut me off. If I tried to continue, he'd just talk louder over me. And if I stopped talking, he would take over the conversation as if I had never even opened my mouth. And it wasn't just me. He did it to everyone. The difference? People eventually stopped trying to argue, which meant that, in the end, meetings became nothing more than Mark talking, and no one having the energy to correct the nonsense he said. The moment I realized this had gone too far was when one of the managers asked for my opinion on a project, and Mark answered before I could even open my mouth. Oh, I think what my name means is that we should focus more on optimization, right? I hadn't even spoken yet. But suddenly, everyone was looking at me, waiting for me to agree. That's when it hit me. Mark not only knew what he was doing, but he also enjoyed it. So, I decided that if he wanted to be the center of attention so badly, I'd let him. I just didn't tell him it would be on my terms. And that's when the real fun began. I could have pulled Mark aside and said, "Dude, can you stop interrupting me?" But anyone who has dealt with a Mark knows that doesn't work. If I complained, he'd pretend he didn't know what I was talking about. Or worse, he'd play the victim, saying he was just trying to contribute, and that I was overreacting. And in the end, nothing would change. So instead of fighting it, I decided to try something different. If Mark wanted to steal my words, I would give them all to him, just in my own way. At the next meeting, when I started talking, Mark interrupted me as usual. But this time, instead of insisting and trying to continue, I just agreed with him. "Exactly, Mark. You nailed the essence of what I was about to say." He looked surprised for a second, but quickly flashed his smug smile. The problem? He had no idea what he was talking about. And I knew that sooner or later, he'd bury himself. So I kept going. In every meeting after that, the moment Mark cut me off, I just smiled and agreed with him. Mark already said everything. Great summary of what I was about to explain. Couldn't have put it better myself. At first, he loved it. But then, things started to go wrong for him. Because now, he couldn't blame me anymore. Before, if he said something stupid, I would jump in and correct him. Now, I just smiled and said he was right. And Mark? Well, Mark talked a lot of nonsense. It was only a matter of time before he suggested something completely ridiculous. And that's when things got really fun. In the third week of my little experiment, we were in an important meeting with one of the senior managers. The topic was a delayed project, and the manager asked me directly, "My name, what's the next step to optimize this delivery?" I took a deep breath, prepared to answer, and Mark cut me off. "Well, I think we can skip the testing phase and launch it straight to customers, right?" Dead silence. The manager frowned. "You want to launch a software update without any testing?" I turned to Mark, smiled, and said, "Mark explained it perfectly. I agree 100%. The room fell silent. I saw Mark swallow hard. He looked at me, then at the manager. "Oh, well, what I meant was..." But before he could finish, I clapped my hands on the table and smiled. "No, Mark, you were very clear. You think we can skip testing. I fully support your idea." He looked at me like I had just pushed him off a cliff. The manager crossed his arms. "Mark, do you really think that's a good idea?" Mark started stammering. "Well, what I meant was, maybe, we could reduce some tests. But of course, that depends on the context." By this point, no one was taking him seriously. And just like that, Mark began to realize that the game had turned against him. But the best part was still coming. Because now, even our colleagues started doing the same thing. Mark left that meeting visibly shaken. For the first time, he couldn't say more than he should. But the most interesting part? The other colleagues noticed what I was doing. And guess what? They started doing it too. At the next meeting, when Mark interrupted someone else to give a completely generic response, the colleague smiled and said, "That's right, Mark. You summed up everything I was about to say." Mark blinked a few times, clearly confused. Later, another colleague was trying to explain a strategy change, and Mark, as always, jumped in uninvited. She didn't hesitate. "Wow, Mark, great explanation. You said it all." Mark looked around, realizing something was off. But no one said anything. We just continued as if he were a visionary genius. The problem? Mark could no longer escape what he said. And with every meeting, he buried himself deeper. The climax came about a month later, in a critical meeting with the company director. The topic was a major project, one of the most important of the year. Everyone was focused, and the questions were direct. And then came the big trap. The director looked directly at me and asked, "My name, What's the best approach to reduce costs on this project? I glanced at Mark. I knew he wouldn't resist. And, of course, he cut me off before I could speak. Well, I think we should downsize the team and outsource some parts of development to cut costs, right? Mark looked satisfied with his answer. But then, something happened. This time, the room went silent. The director raised an eyebrow. Are you suggesting we downsize and outsource? Mark realized he had messed up, and now there was no way out. He looked at me, hoping I'd save him, but I just smiled and said, Mark summed up everything I was about to say. I agree 100% with him. His expression was priceless. 2 weeks later, Mark was transferred to another department. Less strategic, less important. Or, as a colleague put it, the timeout corner. And me? Well, now, when I speak in meetings, no one interrupts me anymore.